Hello and welcome to this special lecture on with an approach on digitization in Africa. In this special lecture, I will be focusing on Africa digital future and specifically applying from lessons from Namibia's 4IR assessment. As the Africa continent thinks of reaping the benefits of fast and rapid digitization, it approaches that from an AU perspective or direction called the Africa Digital Strategy. But with that approach, other global framework also shapes how Africa approaches digitalization. In this case, the Namibia case approaches this with a case perspective of the fourth industrial revolution, an assessment that was instituted by the president of the Namibia a few years ago. So what is this 4IR or Fourth Industrial Revolution? The term itself is coined by the World Economic Forum, which is a European-based think tank, in 2015. And the 4IR implementation informs us that it requires effective, strong, agile, and reliable core perspectives. One of those is ICT, energy, infrastructure, and data system. But the 4IR is also seen to be a key driver of development in general. In particular, ICT and energy infrastructure is a pillar that carries telecommunications, connectivity, and ensuring transmission network as well as digital system. So from a Namibia perspective, lessons that we learned from this country, 6 key aspects were considered in the national assessment. One of those was an assessment particularly focusing on infrastructure and national data, as I've mentioned. The other is future of work, labor force and reskilling, as well as human resource development. And the third one is industry, MSMEs, which is medium and small enterprises, startups, and investment. The fourth is an enabling policy, legislation, and governance. And the fifth is research and development. And the final one is an enabling environment for core 4IR technologies. So in understanding the lessons from Namibia and what that assessment looked like, the country deployed a readiness assessment framework also set out by the apologies about that, but the World Economic Forum. And that assessment framework looks at very key things. The preconditions for 4IR, which is infrastructure, education, innovation systems, and the futures of production capabilities that looks at the structures of production and drivers of production. And the last one is the broader 4IR applications. And with that, key questions were posed. One of those is, does Namibia has the preconditions for 4IR? And the second question is, does Namibia has the necessary capabilities for the future of production? And the final one looked at whether the country had the potential to apply 4IR a bit more broadly. So in this lecture, I will focus particularly on infrastructure, which is ICT, so technology, as well as energy, infrastructure, and data in general. So with that approach, we looked at how to assess existing national hard 4IR infrastructures networks, which is the ICT, and identifying existing and futuristic gap in the infrastructure and data landscape, making recommendations towards integrating positions, infrastructures, and data. And with that, a key tools were used in that assessment, a situational analysis and as well as a readiness assessment, the focus groups with stakeholders. So what did our ICT infrastructure find out? And this can be also applied within other countries. So for instance, what we found out is, in terms of the statistics, the country had over 62 telecommunication services licensed, and it had 38 broadcasting licenses. As we know, information is very key, and broadcasting enables that. The other is that we had over 1,300 base stations for transmission, and a postal service operator that covers the country broadly. In other key infrastructures, so ICT infrastructures, we also looked at network coverage and statistics, where we find out, for instance, that the fiber optic within the countries had a coverage of over 16,000 kilometers, and with the internet users in Namibia were over 53%, and mobile connectivity is covered 96%, I think could be 100% as well, and national coverage by 4G, which is an enabling connectivity in the actual 4IR, covered 79%. But it was also very important for us to look at how nationally that coverage was distributed. So we found out, for instance, there were a number of regions out of the 14 political regions that the country had. About 3 or 4 of them had the lowest 4G coverage beyond 48%. That is Omaheke, Kavango, Kunene, and Kavango West and East. But also we found out that there's also a number of regions where citizens within that region could not have access to better network coverage because of infrastructure distribution. So we found out that many of the regions, or at least 4 or 5 of the regions, had again under 50% of lowest network infrastructure distribution, with the 2 Kavango regions coming in at 12 and 25 respectively, the Zambezi at 22, for instance, and the Maheke just at 48. So why energy infrastructure? I think I've mentioned before that for any of the key ICT, for technology and for connectivity to happen, energy should be present. So in that case, I think I've mentioned before that there's been over 1,700 base stations that connect people to networks, but also that 75% of the urban population is covered by technology, or by energy rather, while only 24 of the rural communities enjoy access to electricity. And this is where challenges of rapid industrialization by technology becomes a challenge, especially in a bigger country like Namibia, where population is very dispersed, and access to electricity even makes connectivity even worse. But generally, 55% of the nation had access to electricity. So that means that the country had 45% of the population that has no coverage whatsoever, or has no connectivity to electricity, and hence making connectivity in general problematic. Furthermore, the country's energy consumption, rate tariffs, and price remained very, very high. This is obviously influenced by a number of factors, such as that we had high import of energy from across the region, that the country is very vast, and the power sector is also very small in size, and the low load densities and long distance between major road centers. I think I've mentioned already that in terms of the access to electricity, 55% of the country has access to the internet, but energy imports is netting at 75% within the country, with only fossil fuel energy consumption coming in at 67, but also that is not clean energy as required in the 4IR. So in terms of the national generated electricity sources, there's coal power, and there's hydroelectric power, solar plant, and heavy powered fuel oil, amongst others. So in positioning Namibia in benefiting in the rapid industrialization, as also known as the 4IR, key issues are necessary. So number one is that the 4IR requires extensive and reliable energy supply. And Namibia's new discovery of the green hydrogen production closes that gap in enabling distribution of sustainable and renewable energy. Data is very, very key in rapid industrialization or by technology. And in saying that, ICT and data infrastructures are the core pillars in the 4 and the 5 information revolution, as I've mentioned. And of course, data is the new oil. It empowers, or it powers artificial intelligence and machine learning, just amongst others. So hence, it becomes imperative to have reliable, accessible, appropriate, and available energy, ICT, and data infrastructures. And the supply of clean energy form is an integral part of the 4IR to function optimally, and collective efforts towards energy, ICT, and data infrastructure. So in conclusion, as we move forward, for the Namibia, lessons that we find from Namibia is that there's been a lack of coordination in terms of data infrastructure, dealing with multiple systems across government services. There's evident fragmentation of data usages and data management, and that the national data is managed through diverse processors and collectors without regulations on how such data is collected but also is processed. Furthermore, on data infrastructure, the National Data Center is absent, and there are no standards and integration of systems in how data is collected, and that remains largely lacking. And data storage concerns is very high, particularly at private sector. And then data storage concern also remains at national levels, where restrictions and there's lack of openness about who access what data. So some preliminary insight, is that there's a lack of investment in ICT infrastructures, particularly in public sector. This is across the larger African continent, where infrastructure development investment is run and is funded by private sector in general. But also that there's been aging national ICT infrastructure. Former infrastructures that existed within the continent, but also within Namibia, were those of the telephony, from the era of telephony. And that industries or private sector in this case goes an extra mile to invest and maintain in the infrastructure potential for public-private partnerships, but even this is not very open. While energy is seen as the sector with the potential to adopt the 4IR technologies, investment in energy is still lacking. So hence there's a need for harnessing opportunities of big data and analytics. There's also inadequate of power and ICT infrastructures as key barriers. I've highlighted this before. And there's also a low rate of investment, which is a critical barrier constraining the adoption of advanced technology from an infrastructure point of view. Affordable and accessible internet connectivity through reliable ICT and energy infrastructure is also a determining factor, but one also that is contentious within the Africa region. And further, that our other insight also adds that there's a strong and positive views on how organizations considers technology as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. That there's a need for strategic adoption of technologies have surged during this time, but also awareness of the latest technological trends amongst industry has been tested by COVID-19. Furthermore, there's a minimal rate of investment that continues to be a critical barrier in constraining adoption of advanced technology and infrastructure. This is also the same for skills. This is also the same for labor within the African continent. And finally, that infrastructure remains the top of the challenges in regards to technology adoption by industry, particularly for a country like Namibia that is large, wide, and a small population, but also very, very dispersed. So what are the recommendations that we're getting from the Namibia lessons? That there should be increasing interoperation of data system within the public service sector and access with access for the private sector and vice versa. That investment in infrastructure or comprehensive national data center should ensure security for both state and private sector as well as the citizenry, and the government should ensure national budget allocation for investment in the ICT infrastructure development. This is one of the key lacking issues across the continent. Further recommendations also highlights that there's a heavy reliance of 4IR technologies on energy that calls for a need to speed up other energy initiatives and make investment towards alternative source of energy such as the green hydrogen for the case of Namibia. An energy sector should support and invest in the grid online projects, for instance, with a common vision where you're providing energy at the same time and using that same route in providing road energy, but also fiber at the same time. Decisively operationalize the Universal Service Fund. This is a UN recommendations while it is present in many of the African countries, for countries like Namibia, it could not take place because of operators are claiming, for instance, high tax already, and this would be an added burden towards that. So in the next section of my lecture, I will be highlighting whether an open and inclusive internet is the answer to Africa's connectivity problem. And for now, I'll end here. Thank you.